company called Ranker. So we're a consumer website that crowdsources answers to questions. There you go. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit, civilpolitics.org, and I have an academic career. Some of you might know me as someone who publishes stuff on moral psychology. And so I have this internet career and the psychology career. I'm trained as a social psychologist. I got my PhD at USC. And these might seem like separate things, but I think there's actually a lot of convergence going on. So I guess what I want to talk about is that convergence and where I think my training in psychology has been really useful, and therefore maybe all of your trainings in psychology can be really useful for those of us in tech. And so it's specifically around measurement. I think that's something that psychologists do really well that I think really gets undervalued in the technology industry, in an industry where everyone's talking about big data. And I was talking to someone who was pretty high up at Google recently, and they said, I was talking to them how the importance of measurement, and they flat out told me like they don't really care that much about it, or it's not a, they'd rather have a data set that's 100 times larger, 1,000 times larger, that's poorly measured, versus one that's better measured and that's smaller. And I think that a lot of us in this room might think of cases where that might not be true, or that might not be the right way to think about things. And I think that perspective is really useful, to give to people in tech who are optimizing algorithms around things like clicks or ad impressions. They're measuring things like demographics and purchase behavior. And as we've talked about yesterday, what we actually care about in life is a good algorithm is one that's fair, right? We want an AI that is on our side, right? Not an adversarial AI. And a lot of that is about understanding, having variables, and an AI is just optimizing towards a variable, and a variable needs to be operationalized in some way. And so we need a measure of, are we living our values? Are we fulfilled? Are we living a meaningful life? And a lot of these companies, you might think they have sophisticated ways of those variables, and my experience is not. Like, a lot of companies don't, and they need psychologists' help to do that, to make variables that these algorithms can be optimized toward. So this is sort of something I found online about what data science is to some people. It's a combination of technical skills and statistics and substantive expertise. I think this is a better representation of what data science should be in the future. And if I were to do this again, I'd probably shrink the data analysis and technology bubble, because every day I get pitched by someone who's saying, who tries to sell me data science as a service. The technical side and even the analytics side, the algorithm side of data science gets easier every day. And it's really understanding the problem set, the domain, and the questions that every company is interested in. Really are around people's thoughts and behaviors. How do we affect those thoughts? How do we affect those behaviors? How do we take those thoughts and behaviors as input? So it's really in the realm of people's thoughts and behaviors, right? Like, all online data sets are not about rocks, they're about people, right? And so psychologists have something really unique to contribute in measuring things about people. So we measure these tangible things. We really care about these intangible things. People in technology don't really understand how to measure these intangible things, so psychologists can bridge this gap between the things we care about and the things we actually measure and optimize algorithms towards. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I do that in my 2 roles. So Ranker is a crowdsourcing platform. We have about 50 million people a month who come to our site and consume our crowdsourced rankings. Effectively, what Yelp does for restaurants or TripAdvisor does for hotels, we do for everything else in the world that we think deserves a crowdsourced answer. So I think people intuitively get the wisdom of crowds, that I'd rather read 5,000 people's opinions about the best restaurant in Berkeley than one food blogger, right? I'd rather read 5,000 people's opinion about the best hotel than one travel writer. And then we do that for questions like best TV shows to binge watch, the greatest minds of all time, the best jobs in the world. If you were to Google important life goals, like, right, strangely, when people don't know what to do with their lives, they will actually Google what's the best life goal. And so people want a quantitative answer to that, not some writer's opinion, right? Best movies of all time, things like that. So and all of these things are, they're not clear answers. They're subjective answers. They're things that maybe might be left in the qualitative domain, but there is a science to measuring it. And it's in that book, The Wisdom of Crowds, and it's somewhat simple, actually. A wise crowd has some level of experience or expertise, so you can't crowdsource, how should I perform a root canal, because most people don't have any experience in performing a root canal. And then you need some independence of judgments, right? You need people who have different sources of error, because if I were to survey people who like spicy food as to the best restaurant in Berkeley, I will get a skewed answer that will just reflect people who like spicy food. I need people who like spicy food. I need people who like sweet food. I need young people. I need old people. If I try and crowdsource the best movie of all time, if I ask just young people, they might say The Matrix. And if I ask film buffs, they might say Citizen Kane. And the answer lies somewhere in between. A great movie is one that young people and old people and men and women and all the people with their various sources of error can all agree upon to that sort of psychometric trait that we call goodness of movie, right? So this is one example of one of our lists. And this is part of my job as our data scientist, is to give input into the product. So how am I going to get diverse opinions? And when we do that is by designing a user interface that gets opinions in different ways. We have people who come to our site, and they might Google best NBA players, come to our site, and then they can vote without registering. And the average person might, 8% of people to this list might vote on it. They might vote on 10 to 15 items. It's a pretty easy thing for people to do without a lot of effort. A really big basketball fan might come and re-rank and make a list of 500 of their favorite basketball players, a really detailed list. And that list is more likely to include people like Oscar Robertson or Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell, right? Like sort of older players, people who only people who really follow basketball will know. And that has a little different sources of error. So the idea is to take the mass opinion and the expert opinion, which both are, it's not like one's better than the other, I would say, but I'd say they all have different sources of error, and then aggregate them in a way that sort of cancels that error out. And so that's a lot of what we do, is thinking about different ways we can measure, different ways we can design products, different ways we can sample, to all have uncorrelated error that we can run the best crowdsourcing algorithm we can. Because ultimately, our success is in having the best answer on the web to that question, and then hopefully Google will reward us. Increasingly, the other thing I do is, I'll cross-correlate all those opinions. A person might vote on 10 to 15 items, they might vote on 2 or 3 lists. So I can say people who vote on Sherlock also like, these actors and these TV shows and these films. And, we try to productize that for entertainment companies. And a lot of entertainment companies are, explicitly not interested in demographics, or they're trying to move beyond demographics. Traditional entertainment companies have marketed to, young men, young women, older men, older women, right? And they're realizing that that's not the future. And the more forward-thinking companies like Netflix know, explicitly will say that is not what we should be doing. And so rather than saying people who like Sherlock also like these actors, we'll cluster analyze these actors and these TV shows and these movies and say something like, oh, do people who like Sherlock like anti-authoritarian themes? Or do they like movies with happy endings, right? Things that are closer to personality traits. If you were to examine the Netflix algorithms, a lot of the variables that they come up with really look a lot like the personality traits that we deal with every day. So that's what I do at Ranker, and there's hopefully some idea of where psychology training is helpful, and thinking about how you measure things in the way that psychologists do is useful in industry. I'll also talk a little bit about civil politics. So I do split my time between industry and then this nonprofit that comes out of my academic work. And civil politics has a very similar, it's sort of a similar problem, in so much as there's a lot of groups working on civility. After the last election, there are dozens of groups now. There's this, we all feel it, right? Like after the last election, people want to do something, and some people wanted to fight, and some people want to more understand. And it's not like you have to pick one or the other. But there's a lot of people out there convening groups of Trump supporters and Clinton supporters, liberals and conservatives, Muslim women and Jewish women, immigrants and non-immigrants, trying to get them to talk to each other in a more civil way. But as psychologists, the question might be, what does that mean? What is a civil way? And for some of these groups, civility is defined as agreement. And for some of these groups, civility is defined as not using bad words or bad language. And in some of these groups, civility is defined as making informed political choices. And we define civility, and it's kind of out of the research that we've done, is in a more affective, emotional way, that we think of it as less affective polarization. And I'm not, I could make an argument for why that's better, but I really just want to make the argument that psychologists are really uniquely trained in being very precise about what it is we're measuring. So when people are saying, we want to increase happiness, right, with this platform, what does happiness mean? Do we mean flow? Do we mean meaning? Do we mean momentary mood, right? That's the question that we would ask, that not necessarily everyone, and then how would you measure that, right? Is there some way you can take the user's behavior and make that a proxy for happiness? And so, we're very precise about what we mean by civility, and that's one thing and then we work, what civil politics does is we work with a lot of these groups across the country that are bringing people together, like the Village Square. So they have these, they bring people together, 50 liberals, 50 conservatives, and they have some program that hopefully helps bridge the division. And then we'll do pre and post surveys and try to understand, and try and actually measure and turn what is sort of a fuzzy trait, like are we reducing political polarization, into data, something that we can actually measure and make graphs about and do statistical tests and have algorithms optimize. And so we see that, for example, a lot of these events, this is kind of the pattern we'll see. People who come with a liberal pattern, with a liberal preference, so they sort of like liberals more than they like conservatives. They think liberals are more good people than conservatives. They will come out of the event with a significant increase in their belief that conservatives too are good people. They won't change their political opinions, but they will change their attitude towards the motives that they attribute to the other side. And so it's just, so civil politics, for the longest time, I didn't really see it as, it was just a nonprofit, not something that was, had a business application. But increasingly, I think we're all seeing, political polarization is not just a nonprofit question anymore. It is a multi-billion-dollar question to a company like Facebook or Google or all these companies that are taking heat for their role in elections and who are composed of people who don't want to have that role in elections, right? So whether it's measuring political polarization or the most important life goal or the best movie of all time, increasingly the things that we're working on in tech are not these things at the lower level, right? Even if we're measuring food, what kind of food should I eat? It's not about calories. It's about, is the food that I'm eating fulfilling the values that I ascribe to, right? Everything is moving up Maslow's hierarchy, and so the variables that we need to be measuring and optimizing algorithms towards need to be the variables that are higher up in the hierarchy, the variables that psychologists are uniquely able to measure and help put into these algorithms. And so that's why I think we need more psychologists working in data science. I think psychologists, it's a very different kind of training. When you come to data science from an engineering background versus from, an applied background, any applied background, you just learn it in a different way. And I think it's been overly dominated by engineers, and there's really a role for people who are not engineers to contribute to data science. So this is my information, some of the websites that I've mentioned, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you very much.